When billionaire CEO Isabella Hartwell stepped out of her Lamborghini at the Monaco Grand Prix, she never imagined the lowly chauffeur loading her luggage would soon be standing on the winner's podium, holding her engagement ring, while millions watched in stunned silence. This is that impossible story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble driveway of the Hartwell estate as Darius Washington adjusted his black suit jacket and checked his watch. At 28, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to navigate a world that often looked right through him. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, gripped the steering wheel of the pristine Bentley as he waited for his client to emerge. Isabella Hartwell was the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she entered a room. At 32, she had built Hartwell Industries from a small tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire, earning her a reputation as one of the most ruthless CEOs on the East Coast. Her divorce from tech mogul Richard Sterling had been front-page news for months, not just because of the astronomical settlement, but because of her public statements about how ordinary people simply don't understand the burdens of true success. Today, she was attending an exclusive charity racing event in the Hamptons, where Manhattan's elite would gather to write checks and network under the guise of philanthropy. As she slid into the backseat of the Bentley, her phone pressed to her ear, Isabella didn't acknowledge Darius beyond a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "No, Richard, I don't care about the optics," she said into her phone, her voice carrying the sharp edge that had made her famous in boardrooms. "If they can't afford our services, they're not our target market. We're not running a charity here." She laughed at something on the other end, a sound devoid of warmth. "Speaking of charity, I'm heading to one of those tedious fundraising events now. At least the champagne is worth the drive." For the next hour, Darius navigated the Long Island traffic while Isabella conducted business calls, each conversation revealing more about her worldview. She spoke about people like chess pieces, discussing layoffs and acquisitions with the same casual tone most people use to talk about the weather. When she finally ended her calls, she seemed to notice Darius for the first time. "You're new," she said, studying him in the rearview mirror. "What happened to Gerald?" "Gerald retired last month, ma'am. I'm Darius Washington with Elite Transportation Services." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Washington. Any relation to the automotive Washingtons?" "No, ma'am," she smirked. "Of course not." "Well, Darius, I hope you understand discretion. The last thing I need is some driver gossiping about my business to the tabloids." "I understand completely, Ms. Hartwell." "Good. And make sure you park in the service area when we arrive. I can't have you cluttering up the main entrance with the other staff." The Hamptons estate was a monument to excess, with manicured lawns stretching toward a private racetrack where vintage race cars gleamed under the afternoon sun. The charity event was in full swing, with Manhattan's most powerful figures mingling on terraces overlooking the track. Darius had attended events like this before, always as invisible help, watching from the margins as the wealthy played their elaborate social games. As instructed, he parked in the service area and began unloading Isabella's bags. That's when he first heard the familiar roar of race car engines, a sound that made something deep in his chest tighten with memory and longing. He paused, unable to help himself from looking toward the track where drivers were preparing for exhibition races. "Nostalgic for something you'll never have?" Isabella's voice cut through his reverie. She had approached silently, flanked by two other women who looked like they'd stepped out of a luxury magazine. "This is my driver," she announced to her companions. "Apparently he finds car racing fascinating." One of the women, a blonde with sharp features, laughed. "How quaint. Do you suppose he dreams of being down there?" "I'm sure he does," Isabella replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "Look at him. You can practically see the fantasy playing out behind his eyes. These people always think they're one lucky break away from being like us." Darius continued his work, his jaw tight but his expression neutral. He had learned long ago that responding to such provocations only made things worse, but Isabella wasn't finished. "Tell me, Darius," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Have you ever actually driven a race car, or do you just dream about it while you're polishing mine?" The question hung in the air, and Darius felt the weight of eyes turning toward him. Several wealthy patrons had wandered over, drawn by the spectacle Isabella was creating. He could have lied, could have played the role she expected, but something in her tone, the casual cruelty of it, made him meet her gaze directly. "I used to race professionally, ma'am." The admission seemed to delight Isabella. "Oh, this is rich. A professional racer reduced to being my chauffeur. How wonderfully poetic." She turned to her growing audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a fallen champion in our midst. From the racetrack to the driver's seat of my car, what a journey that must have been." The crowd's laughter felt like physical blows, but it was the look in Isabella's eyes that truly stung. Pure, malicious joy at another person's perceived failure. She was feeding off the humiliation, growing more animated with each cruel word. "You know what fascinates me about people like this?" she continued, gesturing toward Darius as if he weren't standing right there. "They never accept their limitations. They always think they deserve more than what life has given them. It's almost admirable in a tragic sort of way." That's when Sebastien Leclerc appeared at the edge of the crowd. The three-time world champion was the event's featured guest, a legend whose mere presence had drawn many of the attendees. He looked uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before him, his eyes moving between Isabella and Darius with growing concern. "Miss Hartwell," Sebastien said quietly, "perhaps we should—" "No, no, this is perfect timing," Isabella interrupted, her voice rising with excitement. "Sebastien, meet our aspiring racer. I'm sure you two have so much in common." The sarcasm in her voice was unmistakable. Sebastien looked at Darius more carefully, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. But Isabella was far from finished with her performance. The champagne had loosened her tongue and sharpened her cruelty. She climbed onto a nearby chair, commanding the attention of everyone in the vicinity. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to propose something that will make this charity event truly memorable." The crowd quieted, sensing drama in the making. Darius felt a cold dread settling in his stomach as Isabella's eyes locked onto his with predatory focus. "I'm looking at a man who claims to be a professional racer but spends his days driving my car. It's tragic, really, but it's also given me an idea." She paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the rapt attention. "Sebastien here is the greatest driver of our generation, and our friend Darius believes he belongs in the same league." "Miss Hartwell," Sebastien tried to interject, but she waved him off. "So here's my proposal. Tomorrow we'll have our own little exhibition race, Darius versus Sebastien, one-on-one." The crowd murmured with interest and discomfort. "If Darius wins, I'll not only make a public apology for my words today, I'll marry him." The gasps from the crowd were audible. Even Isabella's closest friends looked shocked by the audacity of the wager. "And when he loses," Isabella continued, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "he acknowledges what we all know to be true, that there's a difference between dreams and reality, between aspiration and capability. He stops pretending to be something he's not and accepts his place in the world." She climbed down from the chair and walked directly to Darius, close enough that only he could hear her next words. "I'll put up $5 million for charity when you lose. Consider it payment for the entertainment you'll provide." The crowd held its collective breath. Sebastien looked stricken, clearly wanting to intervene, but uncertain how. Several guests appeared uncomfortable with the spectacle, but none spoke up. The silence stretched until Darius finally broke it. "I accept your terms, Ms. Hartwell." His voice was steady, carrying a quiet strength that seemed to surprise even Isabella. She had expected him to back down, to slink away in embarrassment, but instead he stood straighter, meeting her gaze with unflinching dignity. "Excellent," she said, though something in his demeanor had unsettled her. This should be quite the show. That evening, as Isabella celebrated her clever humiliation of the presumptuous driver with her friends, Darius sat alone in his small apartment in Queens. The walls were covered with racing memorabilia from another life, Photos of him in a Formula 2 car, trophies from regional championships, newspaper clippings from when he was being called the most promising young driver in American motorsport. The memories were painful. 5 years ago, he had been on the verge of making it to Formula 1, the pinnacle of motorsport. He had the talent, the drive, and the support of a major racing team. Then came the crash at Silverstone during a test session, a mechanical failure that sent his car into the barriers at over 180 miles per hour. The injuries had been severe but not career-ending. The real killer had been the cost of recovery. Physical therapy, surgery, and months without income had drained his savings and forced him into debt. When his younger sister Chiara was accepted into medical school but couldn't afford tuition, the choice had been clear. He sold everything racing-related he owned, took out additional loans, and found work that would pay the bills while supporting her dreams. Now Chiara was in her final year of residency at Mount Sinai, brilliant and dedicated, carrying on the family tradition of resilience in the face of adversity. She didn't know about tomorrow's race. He hadn't told her about the humiliation or the impossible wager. But as he looked at her graduation photo on his desk, he knew she would understand why he had to try. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Sebastien Leclerc standing in the hallway, looking distinctly out of place in the modest building. "May I come in?" the champion asked. Over coffee in Darius's small kitchen, the truth came out. Sebastien remembered him, remembered the promising young driver who had disappeared from the racing world without explanation. He had wondered what happened, had even asked around, but the racing community had simply moved on to the next rising star. "What Isabella is doing is cruel," Sebastien said, "but it's also given us an opportunity." He explained that he had access to the event's racing cars, that he could arrange for Darius to practice on the track early in the morning before anyone else arrived. It wouldn't be charity. Sebastien had seen enough of Darius's old race footage to know the talent was still there, probably sharper than ever after years of dreaming about return. "I won't go easy on you," Sebastien warned. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us. But I'll make sure you have a real chance to show what you can do." They spent the night going over track layouts and racing strategies, two professionals sharing the kind of technical discussion that Darius had missed more than he realized. As dawn approached, they made their way to the track, where the morning mist was just beginning to lift off the asphalt. The practice session was a revelation. Darius hadn't been in a race car for 5 years, but his body remembered everything: the feel of the steering wheel, the rhythm of the gears, the delicate balance between speed and control. More than that, the years of struggle had given him a mental toughness he hadn't possessed in his younger days. He was no longer racing to prove something to the world. He was racing because this was who he was, regardless of what anyone else thought. By the time the other guests began arriving for the main event, word had spread beyond the original charity gathering. The story of the wealthy CEO's cruel wager had leaked to social media, and hundreds of people were arriving to witness the race. Local news crews set up cameras, and the event took on a circus atmosphere that Isabella clearly hadn't anticipated. She arrived in a different Lamborghini, surrounded by her usual entourage, but Darius noticed she seemed less confident than she had the previous day. The social media attention had not been kind to her, with many commenters calling her behavior disgraceful and elitist. Still, she maintained her composure, greeting the cameras with practiced smiles and deflecting questions about the appropriateness of her wager. The race itself was scheduled for 20 laps around the estate's private circuit, a challenging course with sharp turns and elevation changes that would test both drivers' skills. As Darius suited up in borrowed racing gear, he felt the familiar pre-race calm settling over him. This was what he had been born to do, even if life had taken him on a long detour. Sebastien approached him in the pit area, away from the cameras and crowds. "Whatever happens out there, you've already won something important," he said. "You've reminded people that dignity isn't something that can be bought or sold." The green flag dropped, and 20 years of racing instinct took over. Sebastien took the early lead, as expected, but Darius stayed close, learning the track and waiting for his opportunity. The crowd's noise faded into background as he focused entirely on the rhythm of the race. Braking points, acceleration zones, the perfect racing line through each corner. For the first 10 laps, they ran in formation, Sebastien ahead, but Darius clearly keeping pace in a way that surprised the spectators. The announcers, initially dismissive of the amateur driver, began to take notice of his technique and racecraft. Isabella, watching from the VIP area, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the laps ticked by. On lap 15, Sebastian's car began to smoke. A mechanical issue was developing, something that would normally force a retirement from the race. He had every reason to pull into the pits to end the race and preserve Isabella's cruel victory. Instead, he made a choice that would be replayed on racing highlights for years to come. Coming out of the final turn, Sebastien moved to the inside line and gestured for Darius to pass. It was a moment of pure sportsmanship, one competitor recognizing another's right to compete on equal terms. As Darius pulled alongside, Sebastien caught his eye and nodded, a gesture of respect between professionals. The crowd erupted as Darius took the lead with 3 laps remaining, but instead of celebrating, he immediately began looking in his mirrors, watching as Sebastian's car limped around the track with increasing difficulty. Smoke was pouring from the engine now, and it was clear the champion was in danger. On the final lap, disaster struck. Sebastian's car suddenly veered toward the outside wall, the engine failure finally becoming critical. Without hesitation, Darius pulled his car to the side of the track and leaped out, running toward the smoking wreckage as track officials scrambled to respond. He reached Sebastien first, helping to extract the champion from his car just as the fire suppression systems activated. It was only then, with Sebastien safely away from danger, that Darius realized what he had done. He had abandoned a certain victory to help a fellow racer, just as Sebastien had helped him by creating the opportunity to pass. The crowd was on its feet, not because of who had won the race, but because they had witnessed something far more valuable than competition. They had seen character in its purest form. As the 2 drivers embraced beside the track, Isabella stood frozen in the VIP area, her elaborate wagers suddenly seeming petty and meaningless. But the day's surprises were far from over. As the celebration continued and interviews began, a distinguished older gentleman made his way through the crowd toward Darius. He was impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested both wealth and authority. When he reached the small group of drivers and officials, he placed a hand on Darius's shoulder. "Son," he said quietly, "I think it's time we talked." The crowd quieted as Charles Washington stepped forward, and those who recognized him, titans of industry, politicians, and media moguls, began to whisper among themselves. Charles Washington was a legend in the automotive world, having built Washington Automotive from a small parts supplier into one of the largest automotive manufacturers in North America. His estimated net worth exceeded $2 billion, and his influence extended far beyond the car industry. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles said, his voice carrying easily across the crowd, "I'd like you to meet my son." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Isabella, who had been watching from a distance, suddenly went pale. Several people in the crowd pulled out phones, frantically searching for information about the Washington family. What they found was a story of father and son estranged over principles rather than money. Charles had wanted Darius to join the family business after college, to learn the industry from the ground up and eventually take over the company. But Darius had chosen racing instead, determined to make his own way in the world rather than rely on his father's wealth and influence. The disagreement had led to a complete break in their relationship, with Darius refusing all financial support and Charles respecting his son's desire for independence, even as it broke his heart. "I've been watching you from afar," Charles continued, his voice thick with emotion. "When you chose pride over my money, I was angry. When you struggled, I wanted to help but respected your wishes. When you sacrificed your dreams for your sister's education, I was proud. And today, when you gave up certain victory to help a competitor, I knew I had raised the man I always hoped you would become." The crowd hung on every word as the story unfolded. Charles revealed that he had been Isabella's largest silent investor, that Washington Automotive held significant stakes in several companies that did business with Hartwell Industries. More importantly, he had been quietly funding scholarship programs and educational initiatives, including one that had helped pay for Kiara's medical school tuition without her or Darius ever knowing. Isabella, realizing the implications of what was happening, tried to approach the group, but Charles's next words stopped her cold. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I believe you owe my son an apology. Several apologies, in fact." The cameras focused on Isabella as she struggled to find words. The confident, commanding woman who had orchestrated yesterday's humiliation now looked small and uncertain. The social media storm that had begun with her cruel wager was about to become a hurricane, but it was Darius who provided the day's final surprise. As Isabella stammered through an awkward attempt at an apology, he raised his hand to stop her. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice calm and dignified, "I don't need your apology, and I certainly don't want your hand in marriage. What happened yesterday taught us both something important about who we really are." He looked around at the crowd, at the cameras, at his father, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. "I've spent the last 5 years learning that a person's worth isn't measured by their job title or their bank account. It's measured by how they treat others, especially when they think no one important is watching." The words carried weight because everyone present had seen both sides of that equation: Isabella's casual cruelty when she thought she was among friends, and Darius's selfless action when victory was within his grasp. "I want to thank Miss Hartwell for one thing," Darius continued. "Her challenge gave me the chance to remember who I am and what I love. But more than that, it showed everyone here that respect isn't something you can demand through wealth or power. It's something you earn through character and kindness." The crowd began to applaud, but Darius wasn't finished. He turned to his father, and for the first time in 5 years, the two men truly looked at each other. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry it took so long for me to understand that accepting help doesn't mean accepting defeat. I'd like to try again, if you're willing." Charles Washington's embrace of his son was captured by dozens of cameras, but neither man cared about the spectacle. They had found their way back to each other, not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through the simple recognition of shared values and mutual respect. In the months that followed, the video of the race and its aftermath went viral, garnering tens of millions of views and spawning countless discussions about privilege, dignity, and the true meaning of success. Isabella's reputation never recovered from the incident, and several investigations into discriminatory practices at her company resulted in significant legal and financial consequences. Darius returned to professional racing with his father's backing, but more importantly, with his father's blessing. The Washington racing team became a symbol of second chances and family reconciliation, winning races and hearts in equal measure. His sister Kiara graduated from medical school debt-free and went on to establish free clinics in underserved communities, continuing the family tradition of using privilege to lift others up. But perhaps the most important legacy of that day in the Hamptons was the conversation it started about how we treat one another, particularly those we perceive as being beneath us in society's hierarchy. Darius's story became a reminder that every person we encounter, from the person who serves our coffee to the one who drives our car, has their own story, their own dreams, and their own dignity that deserves respect. In interviews after his return to racing, Darius would often say that winning that day had nothing to do with crossing the finish line first. The real victory came in refusing to let someone else's cruelty define him, in choosing compassion over competition when it mattered most, and in learning that true strength comes not from standing above others, but from lifting them up alongside you. The final frame of the viral video that made his story famous showed Darius on the podium after winning his first Grand Prix since his return, dedicating the victory to everyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they don't belong. It was a message that resonated with millions because, in one way or another, we have all been that person, deserving of respect, capable of greatness, and worthy of dignity regardless of our circumstances. Sometimes the person you look down on is actually looking down on you from heights you cannot even imagine. But more importantly, sometimes the person you dismiss as ordinary is extraordinary in ways that matter far more than money or status. In a world quick to judge by appearances and circumstances, Darius Washington proved that true nobility isn't inherited or purchased. It's earned through character, demonstrated through kindness, and revealed in how we treat others when we think no one important is watching. The greatest race, it turns out, isn't always the one that takes place on a track. Sometimes it's the race to maintain our humanity, our dignity, and our compassion in a world that often rewards their opposites. And in that race, everyone has the potential to be a champion.